Welcome to the Texas News Podcast, where we dive into all things Texas and the future of independence in the state of Texas. On today's episode, we're going far beyond our borders to the Western Cape of South Africa. We're going to be talking with Jack Miller, leader of the Cape Independence Party, whose fight for CapExit mirrors our own push for Texit right here in our own backyard. From the colonial history to the modern genocide, Jack lays out a case for independence that's as harrowing as it is urgent. And it definitely offers lessons to Texans that we would be wise to take to heart. So don't go anywhere. Well, friends, so glad you could join us for another episode of the Texas News Podcast. And I have to tell you that today's episode definitely brings a powerful and sobering perspective from halfway around the world, but it's one that hits very close to home. Today, I'm going to be joined by Jack Miller, head of the Cape Independence Party, who's leading the charge for the Western Cape to peacefully separate from South Africa. Jack's journey is personal, political, and at times heartbreaking. He shares the brutal realities of life under ANC rule, skyrocketing crime, state-sanctioned racism, and what many now recognize as a slow-burning genocide against white Afrikaans farmers. But this isn't just about South Africa. It's about how centralized power fails local communities and how independence movements, whether in the Western Cape or in Texas, are born from necessity and not merely nostalgia. We're going to unpack the parallels between CapExit and Texit, and we're going to explore what's driving support for a referendum in the Western Cape. And we're going to talk about what it means when the central government becomes the greatest threat to liberty and your life. This conversation is going to challenge your assumptions. It's going to expand your understanding and, if you're like me, reinforce why the people of Texas must be prepared to go it alone. Well, Jack, welcome to the Texas News Podcast. Look, this is not the first time you and I have met, is it?
No, it's not, and I hope it won't be the last.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Jack and I participated in a sort of an online global summit of independence movements and have gotten to know each other quite well since then. But Jack, I want the listeners and the viewers to get to know you like I do. Why don't you tell everyone a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure, Daniel. Well, it's been a long journey, and not just a long journey for myself, but it's been a long journey for the Cape. And people ask, why do we want to make the Cape an independent country? And the truth is, we were independent for a lot longer than we've been enslaved. So prior to 1910, South Africa did not exist. And before that, we had a long history going back to 1652. 1652, I think your American listeners will appreciate just how far back that date is. And prior to that, we were first explored by the Portuguese in 1488. So when people say that people of European heritage don't belong in the Cape, at least, we'll talk about South Africa later, but the Cape at least, this is absolutely absurd. And I look forward to explaining the history of that later. But the Cape has been independent for a lot longer than it's been trapped within this colonial union of South Africa, which was forced on us by the British Empire in 1910. In 1948, we were taken over by the Nats, the Transvaal-based Nats, and they implemented a system called apartheid. And then in 1994, that came to an end when the ANC regime took over. And so around that time, my father was involved in something called the Committee for the Cape Republic. So I grew up with political figures around me from an early age. I met Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi, one of the great leaders of the Zulu people. I met some of the key leaders in what is now the Democratic Alliance. Prior to that was the Progressive Federal Party, members of the Freedom Front, etc. And so there was a lot of talk around 1994 as to what the new South Africa would look like. And even at that point, there were strong talks about secession or federalism. And my father was one of the founding voices in this movement. However, In 94, the apartheid government sided with their counterparts in the other centrist totalitarian regime. The only difference was the skin color of those they chose to oppress. And at that point, the ANC had said that they were fighting for, or they would implement a rainbow nation where everyone is equal before the law and there would be no discrimination based on skin color. Well, fast forward to 2007, and over a decade into the new dispensation, and it became very clear to myself that the rainbow nation that we'd been promised was a lie, and that we were heading face first into a completely communist totalitarian regime. And that was when I began the Cape Independence Party in 2007. So it's been 18 years now that we've been fighting for this, and we've got many tales to tell.
Well, fantastic. Well, Jack, you and I have had conversations about this. I mean, I mentioned a moment ago that we had participated in that summit. And, we've had, I think, some opportunities to really examine kind of what's happening, what you're doing there. And I'm pretty sure that you looked at what we're doing here. It's been our contention all along that independence movements, the vast majority of them, at least, have threads running through them. It's like I think it was Mark Twain who said, "History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes." And I think that independence movements are similar to like that. What do you see are really the strongest parallels between the situation that you have there in the Western Cape and what we're doing here in Texas?
Well, Daniel, first of all, I've just got to take my hats off to everything that you've done for the secession movement, not just in Texas, but around the world. You're an absolute icon, and anyone that supports self-determination and supports secession is just blown away by everything that you have brought to the movement. So we've got tremendous respect for Texit and the Texas movement. We obviously have tremendous respect for CapExit and the California independence movement and various movements around the world. In fact, I had a meeting with some self-determination groups earlier today from other parts of Africa. So the spirit of self-determination, the fight for independence, beats strong all around the world. And I'd have to say that you guys in Texas are perhaps one of the groups that are leading the charge. Unfortunately, I have to say that the issues you face and the issues we face, I don't want to compare evils of a central state, but I think we're up against a lot worse than what you guys have on that side. And
Yeah.
So the parallels are our love for freedom and our tenacity and our tireless drive to achieve what we were put here to do. And I think we can learn a lot from your movement and your organization. Although I do think that the difficulties that we face here in South Africa are of a different nature than what you face in the States.
Well, and look, I'll tell you, I make no bones about it to our people. We're in an existential crisis, but it's a slow burn in comparison to some of the other independence movements around the world. It's tyranny with a different face and at a different pace. But look, there's absolutely no doubt about it. The existential crisis that you have in the Western Cape is imminent, right? It's at a critical point, and so your push for independence there literally means the difference for some people between life and death. And I want to get to that because you and I got to talking before the podcast, and the South Africa is coming out of everyone's mouths now. The mainstream establishment media are bashing Donald Trump for what happened in the Oval Office. I mean, look, for the first time in a long time, and I believe it's been a long time coming, the U.S., the media, and even the White House are just lit up with claims of systemic attacks on white farmers. What do the numbers actually show, and how would you say that this debate and this newfound exposure for the issue is affecting what you guys are doing in the Western Cape?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking that question. And the big debate that's happening here in South Africa is it a genocide or is it not a genocide? Which absolutely blows my mind that we can be having that discussion. First of all, if we're debating that topic, if it is a genocide or not a genocide, my goodness, is there a problem or is there not a problem? So, in my view, there is 100% a genocide taking place. If this isn't a genocide, I don't know what is a genocide. So, let's look at the definitions here. Boers, the Afrikaans term boers means white Afrikaans farmer. In 1994, when the ANC regime took over, we had approximately 60,000 white Afrikaans farmers or boers. As we sit here today, we have 30,000 boers left. In the last 30 years, the numbers differ. It could be a lot higher, but it's pretty much accepted, and groups like AfriForum and others have recorded the names of every death. These are written in plaques, in stone. These are not fabricated numbers. These are people that died. And let me just say, they didn't get a bullet in the head. Maybe we'll get into it a bit later, but viewers need to understand this is not, we're not talking about 3,000 people that have been murdered in the last 30 years under the ANC regime. We're talking about 3,000 people that were elderly, were women, were children. In some cases, there was a 12-year-old boy that was boiled to death in a bathtub. His skin was coming off him. For hours, they tortured him. It's not nice to talk about this, but people need to know this is not a bullet in the head and stealing a tractor. A mother and her daughter abused with glass bottles so badly that when they found their bodies, they didn't know whether they'd been raped or not. This is the type of sickness, absolute sickness that is happening. They take their blood and they write on the walls, kill the Boer. 30 years of this, 3,000 deaths. That's 10% of the current Boer population. They've wiped out 10% of the current white Afrikaans farming community. Now, if that's not a genocide, I don't know what is. And if you look at the United Nations definitions, you look at a group called Genocide Watch, there is a process here. You don't just say it's genocide when people are coming down the highways with machetes and killing everyone in sight that's white. That is the final form of a genocide. What we have here in South Africa has been a progressive development over 3 decades of this communist agenda. And Cyril Ramaphosa was the person to say this. He was one of the greatest constitutional lawyers that we had here in South Africa, and potentially the world, Dr. Mario Ambrosini, who was the right-hand man to Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi. He, being a member of parliament, had discussions with Cyril Ramaphosa in the early years. And Cyril Ramaphosa openly said to Mario Ambrosini, our strategy, our communist strategy is to boil the white people in this country slowly, like frogs in a pot, gradually increasing the temperature as the frog doesn't realize that it's getting hotter and hotter and hotter until it gets to the point that that frog has boiled to death. And we don't need to look anywhere else, but take Cyril Ramaphosa on his word. He's never refuted this quote that was attributed to him by Mario Ambrosini. And this is what we're facing here. We're entering the 4th decade of ANC regime rule. We've currently lost 10% of the Boer population. And as I mentioned before, it's not just a bullet in the head. It is the most horrific torture for hours and hours because these people are living on desolate farms and these groups arrive and they do the most atrocious things. And anyone who's got a solid stomach, but the will to find out what has been happening in South Africa just needs to Google South African farm murders and they will find out for themselves the atrocities that we face here.
You know, Jack, this is the thing. Well, I'm not going to say that I'm surprised that it blows my mind, right? But that there would be any difficulty on the part of anyone to label this as genocide. I mean, you have to remember we were treated to news story after news story after news story about the Rwandan genocide, the Hutus and the Tutsis. They share the same skin color, right? But they were different tribes, and yet it was referred to internationally and very vocally as a genocide.
Yes.
What is it? Would you say that is holding back the folks in the media or the international the international organizations or others? I mean, what it's obviously part of an agenda, I would guess, but I'd like to hear your perspective on it.
Racism. It's very simple. It's racism. It's anti-white racism, and it's pervasive through South Africa. And I fear that it's become pervasive through much of the world. And for some reason, white lives don't matter to the mainstream media. That's all it is.
Yeah. Well, tell me this, because there obviously have been some reverberations globally from the visit of the South African president to the White House the other day. What's happening on the ground there? How is that impacting what's happening, and particularly with the CapExit movement?
Well, I think everyone had their popcorn out on Wednesday, and
Yes.
no one was disappointed. I think when President Trump dropped the line, "Dim the lights," and then he rolled out the big screen and brought out the receipts, it was an absolute hammering. I don't think we've seen a hammering like that. Zelensky took a hammering from Trump, but I think that might have taken the cake. So yeah,
Well, I did notice that he showed up wearing a suit, so he must have taken some notes from Zelensky's visit.
absolutely right, absolutely right. No, it was an incredible performance, and the performance, there's a lot to unpack. Actually, there's a lot to unpack. So your viewers might not be aware of a party called the Democratic Alliance, but they are the main opposition here in South Africa. And the Democratic Alliance and the ANC have now formed a coalition, including a few other parties, called the GNU, the Government of National Unity. And so Cyril Ramaphosa introduced the leader of the Democratic Alliance, John Steenhuisen, as, "Look over there. Here is my Minister of Agriculture. He's white," as if he needed to explain to the US administration the ethnicity of our Minister of Agriculture. And he proceeded to disparagingly say that he's from an opposition party who joined my side of the political table, and joined our Government of National Unity, and basically dance, white man, dance. And the DA leader proceeded to dance like a monkey and embarrass the rest of us here, and specifically the women and children that have died, and men and boys that have died at the hands of these farm murders. To sit there and say that there are no problems, there is no issue of farm murders in South Africa, we can talk politics here and we can address the issues, and then there's just a moral issue. And it's actually sick. It is completely sickening that, knowing full well what's happening in this country, don't tell me that you are in national government and you haven't taken the time. You might not have read about it in the newspapers because the newspapers don't write about it, but we live in a digital age, and it's not that difficult to Google South African farm murders, and it's out there. If you want to find it, you can find it very easily. Don't tell me that the Democratic Alliance has not done its research and seen the absolute horrific degree of violence that is taking place in these farm murders. To sit there and say that we don't have a problem and it's only a criminal problem, a crime problem, which I'll talk about now, is so disrespectful to the lives of those men, women, and children that died a torturous death at the hands of people that have been inspired by the words of ANC leaders, EFF leaders, and other major political party leaders.
Yeah, it's incitement, and I'll tell you, Jack, in our conversation here, I'm still processing this idea that somehow, people can turn a blind eye to it and essentially say, look, because these are, white farmers that somehow their rights are less. And I'm just thinking back through the history as we've seen it. I mentioned Rwanda earlier, and then, think about how it was plastered all over the media during the Balkans crisis, and they were decrying ethnic cleansing, and it was essentially Eastern Europeans on Eastern Europeans, and then you go back, and I think about Armenia. I think about what happened in Cyprus, or Turkey's effective genocide of the Pontic Greeks. I mean, this kind of thing goes on, and we're told that all of those are genocide or ethnic cleansing and all this and how it's horrible. But suddenly Donald Trump happens to mention it in the White House that it's happening in South Africa. And suddenly the media is just, they just blank out. They've got sudden amnesia
Yes.
about these things. Well, let me ask you this. So, what have been the ramifications, right? I know since we had the big display there in the Oval Office, has that reverberated in the Cape?
Yes, I think it's reverberated in the Cape. It's reverberated across South Africa. It's reverberated across the African continent, and I think much of the world. Certainly, in my interactions with other independence movements across Africa, they are very aware of what's been happening, and these are Black African tribes who are tremendously emboldened and strengthened and hopeful by the Trump presidency. That's important to note, that it's not just, and let me also say that we're talking about Boer genocide here, which is white Afrikaans farmers, but the majority population here in the Cape is an ethnic group called colored. And I know colored doesn't translate correctly to an American audience because I think the word means something differently there. But basically, it's a term that this ethnic group refers to themselves as. And I suppose you could also call Cape Coloreds brown Afrikaners. The majority language of the Cape Colored people is Afrikaans. And if you've ever seen a white Afrikaner and a white English person and a colored Afrikaner getting together, that white Afrikaner will have a lot more in common with that colored Afrikaner than the white English person and the white Afrikaner. For example, that's just to show the bond of the Afrikaans language and the people here in the Cape, as well as outside of the Cape. The reason we talk about the Cape is majority Afrikaans. And so I did send those maps a little bit earlier. I'm not sure if the audience will be able to see those, but it's basically a territory the size of France, and it includes the Western Cape, the Northern Cape, and about 6 municipalities in the Eastern Cape, and then 1 municipality in the Free State. Within this territory, approximately 70% of the population speaks Afrikaans as a first language. And the ANC government has gone out of their way to not just oppress non-blacks, whites, coloreds, and Indians, but to marginalize the Afrikaans language. So what we're seeing here is I would say the worst of ANC policy and African nationalist policy, which drips over into the EFF and some of the other political parties. And I like to go into those numbers just now. But here in the Cape, it's a white issue, it's a colored issue, it's an Indian issue, it's an Afrikaans issue, and it's also a black issue for those communities who have been left behind by a nepotistic system, which only benefits the politically connected. So on the ground, whites, blacks, coloreds, Indians, Asians have all suffered since the ANC has taken over in 1994. And I just wanted to expand a bit more on our discussion about murders and the crime rate, and to touch on the Democratic Alliance trying to say that there's no issue here and it's just a crime issue. That's not entirely incorrect, but it doesn't excuse the duplicitness to say that there is not an issue with white Afrikaans farmers being slaughtered. So there in America, you guys have got a murder rate of 5.5 per 100,000. Israel has a murder rate of 2.4 per 100,000. Australia, 1.7 per 100,000. Switzerland, 0.8 per 100,000. And the Japanese, 0.5 per 100,000. This is a broad spectrum of normal countries around the world. In America, you have a decent amount of crime and a decent amount of murders. India, a little bit higher at 8.2 per 100,000. Now let's move into war zones. War zones like Iraq have a murder rate of 40 per 100,000. Afghanistan, 46 per 100,000. Somalia, 34 per 100,000. Ukraine, 64 per 100,000. Yemen, 61 per 100,000. Syria at its peak was 139 per 100,000. Now let's look at South Africa. Here in South Africa, we average 35 to 45 murders per 100,000. Black, white, colored, Indian, Asian. That is how people are getting murdered here on a daily basis. 35 to 45 murders per 100,000. That's more than Iraq and Somalia. That is in the general vicinity of war zones. So yes, crime is bad. So the DA is correct that crime is bad in this country. That doesn't make it any better. In fact, that makes it worse. You would think that the government, realizing that we've got one of the worst murder rates in the world, would put in measures, anything they could possibly do to prevent murders. They just passed an act, or they're in the process. They've put this bill forward called the Private Security Industries Regulation Act, CIRA. The one thing which helps us and protects us from these murders is private security. This new act that they've put forward will potentially disarm all private security companies across the country. We'll have no means to defend ourselves while the politicians keep their private security. It is sickening. It makes you think that the ANC wants crime to be this bad. And I think they do. And that's a bit of a philosophical discussion. But if you look at the communist agenda, their belief system is one step back to take two steps forward. They think it's fine to absolutely decimate means of production. So you destroy the mining industry, you destroy the farming industry, you create crime to such a high extent that you decimate the ability for communities to defend themselves, to feed themselves, to be productive elements of society. So what happens? The state controls, the state comes in, takes over all of those elements. They therefore, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, they implement this communist agenda that they think will bring about prosperity. But we've seen everywhere in the world, it's a smokescreen to bring about totalitarian, fascist dictatorships. And it's always resulted in tremendous loss of life. And we're seeing that right here. So let me just continue with the numbers. 35 to 45 deaths per 100,000. That's your average South African murder rate. Now, all across the world, the toughest job to have is being a police officer. Here in South Africa, the police murder rate in what is an equivalent war zone of South African murders is 60 per 100,000. So these are the people, we love our police officers. Many of them do a great job. Many of them don't. But they're dying at 60 per 100,000. Afrikaans farmers, Boere, are being murdered at anywhere between 150 to 200 per 100,000. That is unbelievable. Let's take the lower number, 150 per 100,000. Syria at its peak at 139 per 100,000 in a war zone. How can you tell me that white Afrikaans farmers are not being targeted when political leaders are singing, chanting, kill the Boer to stadiums filled with thousands, tens and hundreds of thousands of people singing kill the Boer? And these are the murder rates that we're seeing. It's criminal, and we are so grateful that President Trump has put his attention on this issue, and as a result, he's put the world's attention on this issue. And anyone that wants to do the research that we've done right here, it's easy to see that this is what's happening, and it's about time we put an end to it.
Yeah, it's and I think that the South African government is in a bit of a pickle, right? Because just like you said, if they don't come out and at least say it's a genocide, just get out with it. Look, call it ethnic cleansing, call it genocide, whatever it is, right? The other alternative is, well, you're effectively a failed state.
Yes.
And that has a whole other set of connotations, right? I mean, there's a whole other set of repercussions that come from the admission that you're effectively a failed state. And
Yes.
what I see is that it just bolsters your argument that the Western Cape should reassert its independence. I mean, it's these are all things that I think really play into the trend of self-determination. You guys have the case. Look, there's the political. We know that independence is built on three legs: political, cultural, and economic. And you've hit on the political, you've hit on the cultural. We've talked a little bit and straddled into the economic aspects of this, but give the viewers and the listeners a bit of a picture of economically what's taking place there. And I think, this is a question, but let me caveat with, I think that will serve ultimately as the final nail in the coffin for the fact that for anyone out there who says that the Western Cape should continue to be a part of South Africa.
Absolutely. Yes. When one looks past the horrific states of crime in the country and all the other issues, our electricity blackouts and the racist policies of the government, etc., purely from an economic point of view, the Western Cape would absolutely flourish and prosper as an independent country. So we're paying approximately almost 230 billion rand in taxes to the national treasury on an annual basis. We're getting back in our conditional allocation, our provincial and our local allocation, a total of about 60 billion rand. So we're losing direct access to approximately 75% of the revenue that we produce here. It is mind-blowing. We could overnight, without even changing these communist policies that we live under here, overnight, we could cut taxes in half and at the same time have double the amount of money for schools, for hospitals, for infrastructure, for various projects. It is a no-brainer. That is without even changing policy. And policy is so bad. We have ports that are barely running properly. And the Cape could be one of the most prosperous ports in the world. From east to west, if you want to send your produce and your products from the west to the east, or from the east to the west, America to China, Europe to China, wherever it might be, you've either got to go through the Suez Canal or you've got to go past us here in the Cape. We are one of only two routes of trade from east to west. So the Suez Canal gets more traffic than we do. But as we saw a few months ago, there were issues there with pirates, and it literally ground to a halt. And as a result of that, the Cape became the most important trade route for many, many weeks. So the Cape is not just an important territory within South Africa, but we're an important territory to the entire world. And we really want to have good relationships with both the East and the West. We want to have friendships across the world. We think divisive politics and the type of agenda that we're seeing under the ANC government is not helpful. And certainly in an independent Cape, we would extend our hands as a friendly nation to the West, to the East, to everyone in the world. It's time to put an end to a lot of the violence we're seeing, not just in South Africa, but in the Middle East, in Europe, in Ukraine. I think President Trump has spoken about being a president of peace. I think it's about time we put an end to a lot of the wars we're seeing around the world, and we would be happy to be peaceful partners with all of the great nations that we would call friends in the international community.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the Western Cape and Texas swapping trade missions. I mean, I think that would be, we could, opening up embassies. I want to travel to see you on a Texas passport. And I think what's interesting to me, and I think should be interesting to the viewers and the listeners, is what I said a moment ago. These independence movements, they're not always exactly the same, but they have these similarities. The economic argument that you just made is effectively the same economic argument that we make. It's the same economic argument that Alberta is making right now in Canada. It's the same thing that we heard about Brexit. It's sort of the same thing that we hear out of Scotland. Catalonia was making the same thing. We're hearing the same thing from the Sao Paulistas in Brazil. I mean, it just, it goes on and on. But you're in a different situation than any of those places that I just mentioned, in that you are effectively a part of if not already failed, but failing nation state, an institution that really exists, a nation state that only exists due to a quirk of British cartographers. And you're effectively just trying to reassert your status as it was before, little Lord Fauntleroy got his hands on a Sharpie marker and said, yeah, this looks like a cool country, right? So,
Absolutely.
it's just crazy. So let's just talk about where we go from here. Like what is the status of the movement? What does your process look like moving forward to establish your independence?
Okay, so basically we need a referendum. We either need a referendum that we conduct ourselves as the Cape Independence Movement, or we need a referendum that's granted to us by, get a load of this, not the ANC, but the DA. The DA could give us a referendum on Cape independence tomorrow. And polling has shown that the majority of people in the Western Cape are in favor of a referendum on Cape independence. And there have been polls that have been conducted over the last 5 years or so. And at times where we've had the most political volatility, we've seen those numbers as high as almost 70% being in favor of a referendum on Cape independence, and approximately 60% being in favor of outright independence. So the Constitution of South Africa is structured in such a way that the Premier has the power to call a referendum within his own province. Now, here in the Western Cape, we're not governed by the ANC. We're governed by the Democratic Alliance. So the Democratic Alliance, if they wanted to, could give the Western Cape a referendum, not just on Cape independence, but on a vast range of issues, covering police force, energy, education, housing, etc., etc. So a lot of the issues that we face here, the DA has the power to put forward a referendum. It doesn't necessarily mean they would be binding on the national government, but it would increase the political pressure to such an extent that they could force the ANC to say, okay, fine. We're getting over 200 billion rand in taxes from you guys every single year. It's clear that 90% of your population wants to control their own police force. 90% of your population wants to control your own education. 90% of your population wants to produce your own electricity so your lights don't go out every other week. 90% of your population wants to live in safe streets, which we can't provide as the ANC national government, etc., etc., etc. And we will grant you some reductions in discriminatory policies, and we will allow you greater freedom to determine your own types of policies. Let's just maintain the status quo. The DA could do that. They could do that. They don't even need to call a referendum on Cape independence, but they could address all the issues they talk and shout so loudly about. They have the power to implement it if they just started calling referendums in the Western Cape. Doesn't have to be about Cape independence. However, if the ANC will not negotiate with them in the best interest of us here in the Cape, they then have the power to call a referendum on declaring the Western Cape an independent country. And as our polling has shown, and as other Cape independence groups' polling has shown, we would win that referendum. So the pathway moving forward is either the DA grants the people of the Western Cape the referendum that they want, or we as the Cape independence movement are going to have to call a referendum ourselves. And there are legal pathways to do this. And the principles of self-determination are guaranteed in the South African Constitution. The principles of self-determination are guaranteed in the United Nations and African Union charters, which we are signatory to. So there are a number of mechanisms that we could use to implement a referendum here in the Western Cape. And then the other process is obviously what we've been doing for a long time at the Cape Independence Party. We've got 2 seats in government that we're very grateful to our voters for providing us with. And we need voters to, if they aren't happy with the state of politics in the Western Cape, that they need to vote for the Cape Independence Party and put pressure on the Western Cape government to ensure that we do get a referendum on not necessarily just Cape independence, but issues that would decentralize power to our province and would improve the lives of all of our citizens.
Well, I'll tell you, Jack, and this is where I think we see some synergies, right? And you heard this when we spoke at that on that summit. You know, fundamentally in our Constitution here in Texas, Article 1, Section 2, all political powers inherent in the people, and all free governments are founded on their authority and instituted for their benefit. And the people have at all times the inalienable right to alter, reform, or abolish their government in such manner as they may think expedient. And you know, you have this situation where literally the power is in the hands of the people of the Western Cape to make this decision. Self-determination is a non-negotiable. It's an inalienable right.
Yes.
Like your freedom of speech and all these things. And, you know, I will tell you, so I pulled numbers before we got on, and I looked back at that poll that was conducted in March. And, you know, one of the things, and I think you're being a bit bashful here, is, an independent, a majority want a referendum on independence, but a full 43% are already saying they would vote yes for it. That's higher as it stands right now than polling was in Scotland ahead of their referendum, in the UK ahead of the Brexit referendum. You know, 30% is kind of the starting line, and it's a run. You're at 43%. So what, you know, you're in the catbird seat, my friend. You're in about as good a position as you could possibly get going into this thing. So, you know, looking at those numbers, what is, you know, as the Cape Independence Party, what is your next step? What are you guys going to do from this day kind of forward, looking ahead? How are you going to affect that 43% and turn it into your independence?
Well, as a Cape Independence movement as a whole, the different organizations involved in Cape Independence, we're gonna have to work together to ensure that we do achieve a referendum on Cape independence, as discussed before, there are different pathways to do that. It's certainly very helpful to have international pressure. And the greatest stumbling block we have to achieving a referendum on Cape independence is not the ANC, but the DA. So it's important for all of our partners internationally to realize that the solution is literally 2 steps away. Pressure needs to be put on not just the ANC, but the DA government in the Western Cape. If America wants to see things turn around here in South Africa, it's very simple. The US administration and any other governments around the world that want to see the situation improve here in South Africa, all they need to do is put pressure on the one political entity in national government that has the power and claims to have the will to want to fix it. We know the ANC doesn't have the will. They've told us they're communist fascists. Let's let them be. But the DA, they've told us they want to put an end to these issues of crime and the BEE policies and this and that, etc. If they are sincere, I'm hereby calling on the US administration and any other government around the world that there's a much quicker pathway. They don't need to try and convince the ANC to not be communist. All they need to do is convince the Democratic Alliance to do what they promised they would do. And the mechanism they can use to do it is to give us a referendum here in the Western Cape. It doesn't need to be Cape independence. It can be other issues. Give us a referendum. The Constitution allows it. And from that point onwards, we can begin the negotiating process. If the ANC is smart, they will abide by the decisions in those referendums. And we all know we're going to get 80, 90% plus in favor of our own police force, of our own transport, of our own housing, our own education, energy production, etc., etc. We know we're going to get 80, 90% on those issues. So if the ANC is smart, they will acknowledge the will, the democratic will of the people of the Cape. If the DA is smart, they will provide the people of the Cape the right to have these referendums. Once we have a mandate, a democratic mandate, let's start implementing those policies. And only then, after we've given the ANC a chance and the national government, only then, if they are not willing to allow us to control our own police and our water and our energy and our schools, etc., only then, let's tell the DA the time has now come. We've given them every single chance they could possibly get to give us a rainbow nation. It's very clear we're not going to get a rainbow nation. It's time. Call a referendum on Cape independence.
Well, I think I just listened to a stump speech from the future president of the Western Cape. I just kind of got that vibe. I kind of, guys, just bookmark this for posterity's sake, because that's what that sounded like to me. Look, Jack, from our perspective over here, this is going to be the first time that a lot of people are really kind of slapped in the face with the issues, what the situation is. For supporters of the TNM, people here in Texas, people in the other states, what would you like them to do? What can they do to help you effectuate the independence of the Western Cape, or at a minimum, improve the life and circumstances for the folks there?
Well, let me start off by just expressing my sincere gratitude to the American people for the outpouring of support that we've received in the last few months. That obviously wouldn't be possible if the US administration hadn't taken such a proactive stance in bringing attention to our plight. But it's been remarkable. And I just want to say that from a Cape independence perspective, from a Cape perspective, from a South African citizen perspective, for people that hoped that the Rainbow Nation we were promised might have actually come true, we're incredibly grateful that the spotlight has now been put on the ANC and the EFF and these African nationalist Nazis that control this country. And so if Americans want to do more, as I touched on earlier, ourselves, the Cape Independence Party, as well as others in the Cape Independence movement, have been making efforts to open up channels of communication with the U.S. administration. If any of your listeners have the contacts or the ability to get us into the right doors, we would greatly appreciate that. If people would like to support us, they are welcome to go to our website, www.capexitparty.com. They can read up a whole bunch of material about who we are, why we're doing what we're doing, the history of the Cape. And I believe that an independent Cape would be a tremendous partner for the United States. I think that we envision an independent Cape that is based on the principles of liberty in the truest sense, liberty, peace, prosperity, freedom. And I think these are principles which they are lacking in the world. And if we can begin to move the needle in the right direction here at the foot of Africa, I can guarantee you there are other territories across Africa who we're in contact with, other African tribe areas that suffer their own persecution, who also believe in freedom and liberty. And if the American people, I think the greatest gift that could be given not just to the United States, but to the world, is to carry this torch of freedom through all of the oppressed countries across the planet. And I think that when we spoke a little bit earlier about the changes that you've experienced in America, it's so important that America stands tall and retains and returns to a bastion of freedom and liberty, which might have been lost to a large degree, but seems to be returning. And if that is the case, we believe that an independent Cape could be a shining bastion of light on the African continent to extend freedom, not just in our own territory, but to other parts of our continent, and we pray the world too.
Well, I will tell you, and we'll just at the sake of being repetitive, Jack, I'm looking forward to the day when I could visit Western Cape on a Texas passport, and you can visit Texas on a Western Cape passport, and I could take you to my favorite barbecue joints. I think that would be a lot of fun.
Well, here in the Cape and in South Africa, we call a barbecue a braai. And the offer, my door is open to you and your family. It would be an absolute honor and a pleasure to meet in person and cook a braai for you myself.
Oh, we're gonna make that happen. That is just too great of an offer to pass up. Well, Jack, let me tell you. Look, we're with you. We will do anything we can to assist. We believe in paying it forward, and like we were helped out. If there's anything that we can do, we are definitely we're always down for the good cause of self-determination, my friend. So, Jack, thank you so much for joining me on here today, and look forward to visiting again soon with a phenomenal update, hopefully before you're independent. But, if you get there before our next meeting, then I'm okay with that too.
Daniel, thank you so much.
What Jack laid out for us today should really stop you in your tracks. He's not just talking about policy failures or political corruption. He's talking about a government that's actively enabling the murder of its own citizens. A government that, by any reasonable standard, has forfeited the moral authority to rule. And yet, through all of that, the people of the Western Cape are standing up. They're organizing. They're demanding a referendum. They're refusing to go quietly. And that ought to hit home for every Texan that's watching or listening. Because while we're not facing exactly what they are yet, our path leads to the same destination if we don't change course. an overreaching federal government, a collapsing rule of law, and a future where we don't get to decide how we live, work, or raise our families. You know, the truth is simple. There is no cavalry coming from Washington. There is no rescue plan. There is no reset button. Self-determination isn't optional. It's essential. And if we want to secure our rights, protect our families, and preserve what makes Texas unique, then we better be ready to do what Jack and his people are doing. Take matters into your own hands and accept responsibility for your own future. Not out of rebellion, but out of duty and honor and building a future for our children and grandchildren. So, friends, if you want to learn more about the Cape Independence Party and Jack's work for self-determination in South Africa, visit CapExitParty.com. They're leading the charge for liberty on the southern tip of Africa, and they are not backing down. And if you believe, like we do, that Texas should govern itself, then it's time to get off the sidelines. Support our mission and become a member of the Texas Nationalist Movement today. Head over to tnm.me/join. That's tnm.me/join. Because independence starts with you. And so I will leave you with the words I leave you with every time we're together. They're not my words. They're the words of Sam Houston when he said that Texas will again lift its head and stand among the nations. I believe that time is now, and the question is, will you stand with her?